This video is going to cover the topic of reflecting points on a coordinate graph. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video will be, how do we reflect a point across the x or y axis? We've probably thought of reflecting before, but perhaps not in math. I know that the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about reflections is a mirror. If I look in a mirror, I see my reflection. It reflects what I look like back at me. On a coordinate graph, the x-axis can serve as a mirror to reflect a point. The y-axis can also be a mirror. Let's go ahead and make a quick coordinate graph here with all four quadrants, and let's plot a point, and we'll see how that would be reflected. So let's plot the point -5, 3. That should be right here, -5, 3. If I want to reflect this across the y-axis, that means that this y-axis, I'm going to just shade it darker as I talk about it, this y-axis is going to serve as our mirror. So the point that we have here, -5, 3, should be in the same place, just on the other or opposite side of the y-axis. So instead of this point being 5 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points to the left of the axis, it's going to be 5 points to the right. And it will land right here. Notice that the height of the point, the y value, did not change. I went from -5, 3 to a +5, 3, and these points are now on the opposite side of the y-axis because it has been reflected across the y-axis. Let's look at another example, this time reflecting across the x-axis. This time we'll plot the point -4, 3 right here. So we have -4, 3. And this time we want to see what happens if we reflect across the x-axis. That means that our x-axis this time is going to serve as our mirror. So again, this point will end up in the same place, just on the opposite side of the x-axis. So it's going to be, instead of going up 1, 2, 3 places above the x-axis, it needs to go 1, 2, 3 places below the x-axis. So it'll end up at -4, -3. And I notice here that the x-axis, the x-coordinate has remained the same, just the y-coordinate has changed, and the y-coordinates are opposites. Let's go ahead and summarize some of that information for our notes. First, let's take a look at reflecting over the y-axis. When the y-axis is our mirror, the value of the y-coordinate stays the same. However, on the other hand, the value of the x-coordinate becomes the opposite. We saw this with our example on the previous page, which was that -5, 3 became 5, 3. The x value changed from -5 to its opposite of 5, and our y value remained 3. Let's look at it again now as we reflect over the x-axis. When we reflect over the x-axis serves as our mirror. The value of the x-coordinate stays the same. On the other hand, the value of the y-coordinate will become the opposite. And again, as you can see right above here, in this example, when we reflected over the x-axis, we had -4, 3, and it became -4, +3. Right? The -4, the x-coordinate value, stayed the same, but a 3, became, that should say -3. It became its opposite. We're going to go ahead and just do a couple more. I'll ask you to plot a point, and then I'll tell you where I want you to reflect that point. Let's start by plotting the point 5, 4. When you have that point, go ahead and reflect that point. Let's go ahead and reflect it across the x-axis. So take a moment, plot 5, 4, and then plot the new point and record the value of the coordinate point that you get when you reflect it across the x-axis. How'd you do? Do you have the new point at 5, -4? If so, you did it correctly. Let's try one more. This time, let's plot the point 3, 5, and let's reflect it this time across the y-axis. So take a moment to plot the point 3, 5, and then also to plot where it would land, if you reflected it across the y-axis. How'd you do? This time, your point should have been reflected to the coordinate point -3, 5. The last thing we're going to do before we end this video is try a few without any numbers. So I'm going to draw one more coordinate graph, but this time there won't be any numbers. So on this graph, I don't have any numbers along my axes, so I don't actually know the value of my points. I'm going to do this last one with variables. I've plotted a point, and I know that my variable a represents whatever number it is along the x-axis, and b is representing the y value. So the question is now, where would I mark a -b? Since I know that my a has not changed, my x value isn't changing, and I can tell that I'm just reflecting this b value across the x-axis. So I can put a mark down here and say this would be the point of a -b. This is the point it would be if I reflected across the x-axis. Let's do this again. I'm going to use two new variables, c and d. Right. This time I want to try to figure out where I would need to plot -c, d. So I can see again that our c is becoming its opposite, but the d is the same. That means I'm going to reflect or flip it across the y-axis. So it's going to need to move across to the other side so that the c is the opposite of where it used to be, but our height, our d value, has not changed. So this would mark -c, d. I have one last one here, the variables g and h. This time, let's do -g and -h. This one's a little bit trickier because this time both of the numbers are flipped to the opposites. I'll do this one in parts. First, I'll flip it here across the x-axis and make it g and the opposite of h, -h. Then I'll flip it once more and I'll change the g value to its negative, -g, and of course it's still -h. So my point -g, -h would be all the way starting from here, gh, down here to -g, -h. That's just kind of a weird example, I know, with variables instead of numbers, but it's good for us just to kind of see how it could be applied to any number. That's what variables do. Remember, the essential question of this video was, how do we reflect a point across the x or y axis? We've had a couple examples, but we will of course keep working on this together in class.